construct created to take advantage of others for resource and benefits. The behaviors associated were influenced by who had power and control. People did everything they could to make sense of their perspectives and justify what they did to maintain power and influence. So they searched for the meaning to justify their perspective. So they tried to use religion, science, morality, latest social discourse in order to define others. Once the others classification is there, it made it a lot easier to operate in a way that people actually thought that it was okay, because they created reasoning behind how they perceived a Black person and what the Black person's role was in the society. So that's the grounding foundation of America and how America was shaped. And there's nothing, there's nothing that we can take that away from, because that's the reality of the Black men and women experience in America. So it's very important to understand that. And the reason why it's important is because when you start looking at kind of the Black experience over time, the root of how Black people were viewed was still very much the foundation of what the Black experience became later. So the term white started to appear in colonial law. And then we started to see by 1790, people were asked to indicate their race on the census. And by 1800s, when waves of other immigrants entered the state, the concept of white race was solidified. And most of the new immigrants that arrived, they wanted to be classified under that category because they saw what kind of privilege people received. This is not to say that every immigrant that came had equal rights. As you guys all know, when you think of American history, depending on different ethnic groups of people that came here. But the big differentiation was, we definitely don't want to be in the same category as Blacks. Because the category that Blacks had was, they were slaves. They were not human. So racism in America went through a transformation after the Civil War era. There's the concept of modern racism, which is more the subtitle forms of racism. It's concealed in the fabric of the society. There's the symbolic racism, the feeling that Blacks are violating cherished values and making illegitimate demands for change in the racial status quo. And then there's the averse racism, a conflict between the denial of personal prejudice and unconscious negative feelings and belief. So it's very important to be able to understand some of those contracts, because that's what has shaped many disparities and many differences that people experience today. And what we're seeing in our society is that catch up. We're trying to catch up around changing minds, around systematic perspective that were infused in people's being through generations and generations. And we think we can just change it by the external perspectives. And we forget about the systematic construct that's been infused in people's perspective and mindset, that's infused into media, storytelling, representation, beauty. So my goal in this presentation is to look at the internal, the inner being of what influences how we see one another and how we treat one another. And the fact that race is a social construct is defined by markers such as skin color, hair texture, eye shape, ancestral identity, performance, and even by name. And then the modern symbolic racism, some psychologists kind of group it together where they say modern racism and symbolic racism is infused into more of political conservatism, disclaim personal bigotry by strong and rigid adherence to traditional American values, like individualism, self-reliance, hard work. They forget that what was happening when those values were being manifested. So it goes back to the roots of, oh, what America was. But they forget that what America was during that time that shaped American values also discredited an entire human population. So when we talk about going back to the root in the tradition of American values, what are we actually talking about? I know I mentioned conservatism, and some people, as you're hearing me, you're like, ooh, is this becoming political? So the adverse racism is more characterized by white liberals, where white liberals are strongly motivated by egalitarian values as well as anti-minority feelings. Their egalitarian values operate on a conscious level, while their anti-minority feelings are less conscious and more covert. And some people actually say, I rather know how you feel about me directly than the idea that you're on my team, but you're really not on my team. So here we have two different contracts in how white Americans view these perspectives and how it manifests. One manifests more physically, so you can see it through a symbolic racism or modern racism, where people are more voiceful about how they feel about certain things. And then the adverse racism is the one that's hidden. So I wanted to kind of give us this picture, and this slide actually comes from Dr. Robin DiAngelo's work. She's the one who she wrote the book, White Fragility. So she states that state-sanctioned discrimination against Black people. So when we look at this is kind of the history. So you look at kidnapping and 300 years of enslavement and torture, rape, brutality, medical experimentation, Black codes, sharecropping, bans on testifying against whites, mandatory segregation, bans on Black jury services, voting, lynching, and mob violence, imprisoning people for unpaid work, bans on interracial marriages. By the way, like interracial marriage was completely abolished until I believe it was like 1960s, late 1950s. Interracial marriage was finally allowed. Redlining to profit realtors and bankers, employment discrimination, educational discrimination, bias laws and policing practices, white flight, subprime mortgages, mass incarceration, school to prison pipeline, disappropriation, special ed, referrals and punishment, testing and tracking, school funding, biased media, representation, and historical omission. So that's been in the experience of, that's been part of the Black experience in America within the last 300 years. So part of my presentation today, we're gonna look at how the bias, what informs our bias and where our bias comes from. So Dr. Ibrahim Kendi is an amazing researcher, writer, and for us New Englander, we're really lucky that he actually just moved to Boston, so he's gonna be leading their racial justice program at Boston University. And he says, if we truly believe that all humans are equal, then disparity in condition can only be the result of systematic discrimination. So if we personally, as humans, we say, we're all equal, we're all the same. But then what creates the disparity around the negative ways that we treat one another? If we all believe that we're all equal. So what actually creates, what creates the negative impact? What creates this, what we just went through? What created all of that? What caused all of that? Because that didn't happen just in 1 year. That didn't happen, maybe it was just 10 years and then people, came to their senses. This negative impact has happened for the last 300 years. But if we all believe that we are all human, that we all have the same right to breathe the air that's outside, that we all have the right to have the same experiences, we all have the rights that are binded within the Constitution, then what has caused all of that? Most of us are fighting to be exempt as part of the problem. Oh, I'm not the problem. I feel a certain way. That's not my perspective. Unfortunately, the society around us has that history that I shared earlier has been infused in every part of our society. And it also has informed how we see one another and how we treat one another. So part of this presentation is not to put you in a negative vibe as me calling you out, saying that you are part of the problem, but we are all part of the problem. So in my work, I focus on intention. Because for most of us, that's where we tend to go. Here's my intention. This is who I am as a person. This is how I show up. This is how I want to be. So my question to you is, how are you going to bring your positive intention to life in order to make an impact? Because if you're grounded by your intention, which your intention is, it's defined by who you are, right? Your intention is my being, you know, the nature of essence of a person, right? That's your being. If your being is influencing your intention, how is your intention going to manifest externally in order to make an impact? And that impact is only measured by your doing. Your intention is great, it's awesome, it's amazing. But if it doesn't manifest into doing an action, then we can't measure it. Then you can't measure it. So part of this work, it's about how do you reflect internally and how you perceive the world around you and how you want to show up. And where are opportunity where those positive intentions that you have actually manifest externally. Because if the core principles of what shaped America, our founding fathers and how they thought about one another and what the experience of building this country was going to be, if it truly, truly represented everyone, then the experience that African Americans had wouldn't have been. It wouldn't have been that way.
It won't.
Oh, can you please mute yourself? Thank you. So I'm bringing it to you now. It's easier to be external, right? To think about others and what others have done. So this is to you. What is the impact that manifests through you? So I want to share this photo because we're going to talk about biases. I graduated out of college with my undergrad, international relation and history. And I got this State Department job. I was so happy. I'm like, oh, let's go. And part of the State Department job was to work with 40 Pakistani education leaders. They came straight from Pakistan, from all over Pakistan, Islamabad, Lahore, KPK. And I was going to spend 3 months with them as an advisor to their master action plan that they were going to put together in the state and then travel back to Pakistan and implement it. I got so excited. I was like, let's go. And guess what happened? All of a sudden, deep inside my heart, I started having my own negative feelings. And I said, I'm young. How are these Pakistani leaders are going to respect me and value me? Because I was so much younger than they were. 2, I was like, I'm a black person. So like, have they ever had any interaction with black people? 3, I said, well, they're probably all Muslim. So like, that's not the religion that I practice, right? So all these different perspectives started to impact this amazing experience that I was going to have. And my own biases started to take over. And I started second guessing if I was the right person to be involved with this program or not. I went from being excited, like, yes, I just graduated from college, yes, to, oh man, I don't think I'm the right person. They have different religion. I'm young. I'm African American. I'm going to be traveling with them. I'm going to be doing all this stuff. They're not going to respect me. So this might not even be an experience for me. But I had to confront my own biases if I was going to continue to engage in this program. And one of the things that I realized that I needed to do was I needed to meet them where they were so they can authentically meet me where I was. I remember the first time we picked them up. In the picture that you see, most of the girls, you can see their face. But when we first picked them up, they were all covered. And I remember with some of the guys, I was like, man, how am I going to design that relationship? But I said, you know what? I'm just going to be me. And part of being me, they're able to understand who I was, what I cared about, and why I was there to help them. And something really cool happened. On the last picture on the bottom right that you see, it looks like a little festival thing. My wife and I, at the time she was my fiancée, we were preparing for our wedding at the end of the summer, which was at the end of this work. I was able to design such a cool relationship with them that they said, hey, Dale, for our final presentation, we actually want to show our culture tradition through throwing like 5 different weddings for you and your wife at the same time so we can share how our community celebrates. And I remember at the end of this program, I was so blown away of how much when I put down my own biases, my own negative perspective that was coming out of me in an experience that I was gonna have that I was so excited about, that it allowed me to meet these Pakistani leaders where they were, and they were able to meet me where I was. 12 years later, I'm still connected with them through social media. They message me all the time. During my birthday, I get the happy birthday before everybody else because of where they are in the world. So the reason why I wanted to share that is to level set with you guys, because if we do not create the space to confront and identify how our biases are influenced, then we're not going to be able to take our positive intention and how we want to live out and how we want to treat one another to actually let it come out as doing, and then for us to be able to measure the impact of it. So I decided to come up with 10 lists that we're going to focus on today. And you can take notes if you want. You can do whatever you want in order to get you to a place where you feel like, it's going to be a lot of information, but we got this. This is the heart of the work today. And this comes out of Kendra Sherry. She wrote a book called Everything Psychology book. And the way that she defines this cognitive bias, I find it to be very relevant to a lot of the work that I've been doing within the last 4 years, hosting community discussion with different groups of people. So we're going to go down through this list. And as I go down the list, please reflect within yourself of how these biases may be manifest within your perspective and your opinions. So the first one is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is, just give me 1 second, I have double window here. Confirmation bias is when people tend to listen more often to information that confirms the beliefs they already have. So people tend to favor information that confirms their previous held beliefs. What informs your perspectives of people of color? Instead of listening to the opposing side and considering all of the facts in a logical and rational manner. But if your perspective is always based on your own experience, or you trying to prove and validate something that you're already holding on to, then you're missing the opportunity to actually get to know people based on who they are and what's actually playing out at face value. And that's the starting point for most of us. We want to confirm our own beliefs, so we're always searching and trying to find the connection that validates our point of views. And at the same time, we're missing out on the opportunity to actually meet others where they are in order to understand what is their experiences outside of our own belief. So my question to you, and we'll come back to this question, what are certain things that are indicative of the confirmation bias working to support your opinion? Is the confirmation bias, is it more of what happens first? Is the actual bias itself, does that happen first? Or is it the perceptions of how you see others? And then you go back to your own biases. The second one is hindsight bias. That's the tendency of people to see events, even random ones, as more predictable than they are. So this tendency to look back on events and believe that we knew it all along. So after it happens, you're like, oh yeah, I knew that that was gonna happen. And after it happens, to shift their point of view and indicate it would have happened the way it is, even though that was not your initial thought or perspectives. Our tendency to believe we could have foreseen certain events prevents us to confront, why did we think about it that way before it actually happened differently? But we're so quick to say, oh yeah, we knew that was gonna happen. And this occurs all the time. We misremember previous predictions, or our tendency to view events as inevitable. And there's a lot of research around this, especially through like when people are recounting an event that happened, especially through if there was a crime that happened and someone came in and is like, oh yeah, this is what happened. There's a ton of research around this where someone, depending on how the question is asked, that person's like, yeah, it definitely happened this way. And then they go back and they tell a completely different story because they're able to go back and find the connection. So it's very important for us to be able to understand that hindsight biases occurs all the time in order for us to feel a certain way in our perspective of how we see things and how things play out. The third one is anchoring bias. We tend to be overly influenced by first piece of information that we hear. So the first voice or the first number that we hear, automatically we're like, oh, that's it. So example is if I asked you guys, I was like, hey, how many states in America, have more than 1 million, or how many city has more than 1 million, how many states have more than 1 million African-American living in it? And some of you guys would be like, if someone threw like a random number, someone's like, 250,000, or like, there's 250,000 as an average, and there's probably 8 states. Even if that number was like way off, for some of us, automatically we're gonna base all of our answer based on the number that someone guessed. And especially living in a social media world, there's all of this data out there. Everybody's always posting different things because people wanna validate. People want to validate what they think and how it pertains to them. And the thing about anchoring bias is that it's influenced a lot of the way that people negotiate their salary, the perspectives that doctors have, and it can definitely become more susceptible to the anchoring bias when diagnosing a patient. And this leads to incorrect influencing of subsequent diagnosing assessment, where a doctor is looking at an issue based on other factors and they're able to make that connection. And for some of you guys to know, there's been a lot of misdiagnosing around people of color, depending on different severity of issues that they have. And this is how this anchoring bias plays out in our society. The next one is the misinformation effect. Our memories of particular events tend to be influenced by things that happen after the actual event happened itself. So we focus more on, oh, this happened. Oh, well, we remembered it this way. And the thing about our memory is it's surprisingly susceptible to even very submittal influence. So at any time, something else can come and influence our memory. And Elizabeth Loftus, she's a psychology professor, and she's done a lot of research around this, around the criminal justice space, where she goes in and interviews people to try to figure out, okay, what events are they retelling? And this is even proven to sometimes when people are witnessing, people are coming in as witness, you know, they feel so convicted that person was the person who did it. And on someone's mind, they actually believe that they really believe that the person that they're pointing out is the person that committed that thing. But in reality, that person wasn't the person that committed it. So we have to be aware that sometimes our brain gets influenced by misinformation of events that didn't even occur, but we have taken ownership of it to believe that it actually happened. The fifth one is the actor-observer bias. We attribute our behaviors by external factors and attribute others' behaviors by internal factors. So we have a way to justify when we make a mistake or when we do something wrong. We'll say, oh yeah, it was, you know what? Like I totally bombed this test because the questions were so confusing. But then someone else bombs the test. You say, oh, you know what? You know, that person probably doesn't have the intelligence. And we see this play out in our society even more so around how we perceive other people's experiences. You hear this all the time. Well, why can't just black people just get it together, right? Like slavery happened so long ago. You know, they can just succeed, right? They can just work like everyone else have worked and be able to make it happen. You know, maybe there is something genetically wrong with him. We hear people have this perspective. People have this opinions. But then when an issue happens for them, they have a way to reflect it by blaming it on external factors instead of blaming it on internal factors. False consensus effect. Overestimate how much other people agree with your own belief, behaviors, attitude, and value. Believing that other people are just like us is good for our self-esteem. But then this can lead people to incorrect think that everyone else agrees with them. Overvaluing your own opinions, finding everybody else that aligns with you. And this is what makes the social media algorithm so powerful and dangerous. Because the belief of everyone else believing in what you believe in doesn't create the space for us to confront, why do we feel this way? Even when other people are saying, hey, you know what, like your point of view on that and how you show up, it's definitely holding me back. It's definitely treating me this way. Instead of taking it at face value, all you're doing is like, let me go find other people that believe in me so I can justify how I feel about it and how I'm showing up. And this false consensus effect, when you are in a place of power, it affects it even more because then you're not able to meet others where they are in order to understand their experiences. And you might have the power to actually change the negative experience that they're having. But so you're so quick to try to find others and try to find alignment with your own belief and perspective instead of coming to meet others where they are. The next one is the halo effect of bias. And this is more around physical attractiveness, stereotyping. We tend to lean towards what we consider to be beautiful as good. So just because something is beautiful, automatically, especially when we're associating it to human being, automatically we think that that person can never do wrong and that person is like the best at everything. And the problem with this is how we define beauty impacts how we treat others. So within the society that we're in, if the definition of beauty does not represent other communities or other individuals because it's outside of the contrast of what informed you beauty was, for some of us, then you can't even give the benefit of the doubt in order to confront how the physical attractiveness impacts how you see, or the lack of a physical attractiveness impact how you see. And this biases gets influenced around job applicants. Someone applies for a job and they're coming for an interview. You perceive them as attractive or likable. And then all of a sudden you think, oh, this person is more reliable. This person is more competent. This person is smart. This person qualified for the job. And how many stories or quote unquote, some of you guys might say complaints that you hear from people of color around them feeling that they were prejudiced or they were discriminated towards when they went for an interview, or when they were up for a promotion, or when they were up for consideration. The society that we live in informs how we define beauty. So for us, it's very important to be able to understand how we define beauty influences how we see and treat others. Because if you don't create the space to be able to confront that, then you're going to allow your brain to be on autopilot. And when the next time you're about to hire someone, they walk in, they might not wear a name brand shirt, or they might not be, you know, there's certain criteria that you look at. And in order for you to be like, from the external standpoint, for you to feel confident enough. And right away, as that person is speaking to you, already your brain is kind of closed them off already. Because how you perceive them externally defines them as they're not good enough. And then you miss the opportunity to actually hear them out, to actually meet them where they are and treat them fairly, to consider if that person has the skill set or not. And I would like to tell this story real quick.
Dale, quick question.
Yes.
Someone was kicked out and they were trying to get back in. I don't know if you see anybody in the waiting room.
Okay, give me 1 second here. I'm gonna stop sharing. I do not see them. Sorry about that. I do not see them. Oh, okay, I see them. All right. Let me share my screen again. Oh, let me share my screen. All right. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
You see the slide?
Yes.
Super. All right. So I'm going to tell a quick story real quick. So I grew up in Manchester. I'm originally from the Democratic Republic of Congo, the heart of Africa. And when I moved to Manchester, New Hampshire is like one of the whitest state in America. And something that I realized, a lot of the experiences that I had by the time I was in middle school, I ended up going to this, up to that point, I went to like 2 ELL schools, English learner schools, and my class looked like this. It was very diverse. I had friends from Dominican Republic, the Congo, everywhere, different places. And then in 7th grade, I transferred into a small Catholic school, and there was only 2 black kids. The whole entire school was 350 students. And as I was in my quote unquote puberty years, I didn't realize until later on in my life that the way that I view beauty, it was actually influenced by the surrounding that I was in. My friends, what they consider that was beauty, at least within the school environment that I was in. And that was infused in me because as a young man living in the space where it was predominantly white state, but also going in a school that was predominantly white, there were some external influences that occurred that I wasn't even aware of. So then at the same time, I viewed white girls as attractive girls. because my friends also viewed white girls as attractive girls. Because that was like the cool things, right? Like, I mean, that was part of their society, right? That they didn't know anything other, right? Like the way that what informed their perspective of beauty was based on what they were in. And I remember early on, most of the girls that I dated when I was in middle school and high school, they were predominantly white girls. And it's crazy that the way that the society that are around us influences us. And if we're not aware of how much it influences us, we forget that our perspective actually comes from a collective experiences or what's real to us. And so later on, I actually, I got involved with an after school program that I worked with students from all over different background that lived in my community in Manchester. And here's a picture of, and during this time, a lot of my students were from Iraq, from Sudan. This is where I would volunteer my time in the evening. And I started to see some of the boys who were like really talented in soccer or track or or whatever it was, when they had a little bit of like popularity, most of the girls that they dated were white girls. And I remember one time I pulled the boys together and I asked them, I was like, hey, you know, we got some sisters too, right? And some of them joking around, like, you know, they said some stuff where I was like, okay, so where's that coming from? I remember one student was like, oh, you know how black girls are, Dale. I was like, what do you mean black girls, man? Like your sister is black, your aunt is black, your mother's black, your grandma's black. So what do you mean by that? And at that moment, he was like, oh, like it actually it caught them off guard. They're like, oh, no, that's not what I meant. And I was like, oh, snap. This is the same thing that was happening to me when I was younger. So it's very important to be able to disrupt our perspective in how we define beauty. And it's very important to be able to be aware of how much of that influences how you consider others. That the fact that if something that's beautiful or something that you think is attractive or whatever it is, it doesn't mean that every aspect of that person, that they're good, that they're more qualified. So next time you have a Hispanic person or a Native American person or an African American person or someone from Asia or someone from South America that comes into your office for an interview or whatever it is, you're about to make a decision, try to reflect within yourself, what is informing my way of considering this person if they are ready for this position or not? Because for some of you guys, you might be able to identify that stereotype might be there and it might be blocking you from considering that person.
Deo,
yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. Two things. Another person got kicked out and they need to be let back in. And then also during your slides, there's like a square that is overlapping on top of the text that you're displaying. And we didn't know if there was any way to get rid of that. It might just be your presenter mode.
Yeah, it might be how I'm sharing it. So let me come out and put someone up. Oh, yep, this should be in now. All right. Are you still seeing the square? Oh, you know what the square is? I think it's from Zoom. All right.
Okay, that's gone. The square is gone. And then someone asked if you can give me co-host duties. I'm not sure that I'm skilled enough to do that, but I'm happy to help if you're able to.
Okay, super. Thank you. All right, so the next one is self-serving bias. People tend to give themselves credit for success, but then they lay the blame for failures on outside causes. This bias is there to protect our self-esteem, but it is dangerous because we often rely on it. It leads to faulty attributions, blaming others for our own shortcoming. So this goes back to that slide I had earlier around your intention, your doing, and impact. So if you find yourself giving yourself credit for success, but you're quick to blame the failures on others, then this is an opportunity for you to be able to evaluate what influences this. Because part of the division that we have within our society, it really comes from that. We're so quick to say, oh, well, this is this. Oh, well, that's that. You know how many times people say, well, you know, black on black crimes is. And a lot of time I tell people, do you know that most communities that black people live in are predominantly black people that live in those communities? Just like the same way where there's community where a lot of white people live in the community and there might be some other socioeconomics or challenges that they have that might have an increase of crime within those community. So we're so quick to allow that self-serving bias to be able to influence our perspective. And then we put that stick on the ground and say, oh, this is the reality and this is what's happening for everybody else. And the last one of our bias is the availability heuristic bias. You believe something is more common than the reality. You start seeing car theft coverage in your neighborhood. You start believing such crimes are more common than they are. You start seeing different things that's being covered around different groups. All of a sudden, even though that's not your own experience that you've experienced yourself, you take that at face value and you say, oh, you see, that's what happens to them. They always do that. Oh, they always do that. You start to believe. You start to believe all certain groups have this characteristic or they have that attributes. You start to estimate and anticipate the probability of something happening based on how many examples readily come to your mind. So you're walking down the street and you see a certain group and you clench your purse and you walk across. Or you're about to go rent a place to live in and the landlord happens to be a person of color, and then you get a second bag. And I tell this story because I used to own a multifamily, and this happened to me so many different times when we listed our apartment for people to move in, that I actually got so upset that it was happening so much. Guess what I did, guys? I actually had a description within my listing that said, African-American family own this building and they live on the first floor. Because so many different times people would show up, my name is there. When they show up and I say, hi, my name is Deo. Are you the owner? Yes, we've been communicating within the last week and a half. And I did not change my name. I'm still the same person. It happened so many different times that I decided to put it in my description of my listing so people knew ahead of time if there was any preconceived notion that they didn't want to rent from an African-American person, that they wouldn't even consider coming, because then that awkwardness that occurred of them like sizing me up didn't have to happen. Sometimes, guys, I will get out of work and keep my work clothes on. So when someone comes to my house to look at the property, that they feel comfortable enough to be like, oh, he's a young professional. He works corporately, so I don't have to be afraid. He's not a drug dealer. Somehow he sold so many drugs that he has his own apartment building, so he's renting it out. You know, that's probably not a place we want to live. Literally. And then at some point, I just told my wife, I'm like, listen, you might have to list this place. Over and over and over again. Why? Because what happens within that heuristic bias is that it's so much easier for some people to take those external movement that happens and take that and include it as an attributions of a certain groups. And when it's negative, it also shapes when it's negative, it also shapes your point of view and how you treat others and how you see them. And then the last one is optimism bias. By the way, guys, this is one of the hardest words for me. I always have the hardest time saying it, and I think I said it right. Yay. We tend to be too optimistic. We overestimate the likelihood that good things will happen to us while underestimating the probability that negative events will impact our lives. We assume that events like divorce, job loss, illness, and death happen to other people, that it can lead to people to be health risk like smoking, eating poorly, or not wearing a seatbelt, because we assume that nothing negative is going to happen to us. So then what happens is when other people are talking about negative events that occurred within their life, you get defensive because you said, well, that's not my point of view. That's never happened to me. So that's not true. That person is just making that up, because there's no way that that's their experience, because that's not how I perceive them. If I don't perceive them that way, then it means that others don't perceive them that way. Then what they're saying happened to them, it's not true. I know this was a long list and I went through it, but I wanted to give us a perspective of this, because we started with the being and the doing, which is the internal impact that influences how we show up externally. Because a lot of people, when they talk about these issues that divides us and where we are as a community or as a culture or as a nation, they focus so much on the external stuff that's happening that we see visibly, but they forget about what's the driver. Where did the things come from? What was the root that caused this to occur? So this is an opportunity for us to break out into groups based on, I know I gave us a lot of information to chew on, but my question is, how does bias influence your negative perspective of others? If you can think of the different example that I provided. And this is your opportunity, because a lot of time, we try to pat ourselves in the back, we're this, we're that, but this is an opportunity for you to reflect internally, personally, to think about how your own personal bias influence the negative perspective that you might have on others, or negative perspective you might have on certain situation or experiences without it being true, or for you to actually evaluate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give us a 10-minute discussion into breakout groups. You're going to go back in the same groups that you had, and then we're going to come back and we'll be able to close out very soon. But yeah, so I think everybody's back. So I'm gonna bring this to a close. You guys have survived. You've made it towards the end here. Thank you so much. I'm gonna share my screen and we're gonna finish up here. Let me see, where is my screen? Okay. All right, so this is it. This is the final countdown. This is the final run. Okay, so I'm going to run through this real quick, and then we have some solution here that we get to talk about. So the way that I view it is, so all the biases that we discussed earlier ends up playing out, in this form of the manifestation of microaggression. And the actual microaggression term came out of 1970 through a psychiatrist professor at Harvard, Chester M. Pierce, where he was looking at the experience of African-American students within the community, and he realized what was playing out. So he coined kind of the word and the term microaggression. So there's two sides of the aggression. There's the macro level, where most people would kind of define that as extreme forms of racism. So, you know, I don't know how you define extreme forms of racism, right? What's the measurement, right? So some people might see it from an external standpoint, like, you know, lynching, burning, and beating, and something that's more severe and a greater. And I don't think that we should be in the place to define what is macro and what is micro in terms of the severity of the impact. But this is how it's defined. And then the microaggression are verbal or behavioral that communicates hostile, derogatory, or negative attitudes towards stigmatized or culturally marginalized groups. So sometimes it happens in micro assaults, micro insult, or micro validation.
And how we show up for people. I guess it maybe wasn't a question, but it was more like an observation. Like, people sometimes aren't aware that how they're showing up is triggering trauma in other people. And being sensitive
100%.
to that.
Yeah, I think so a lot of my work, it's about being transparent and explaining your intention, so you can create a space where people, you know, there's a space where people can express themselves. And I experienced this a lot when I was working corporately. I used to work for this university, and they had this really amazing program, but most of my corporate experiences, I was the only person of color. So I remember one time we had a gentleman who came from Cincinnati that started working with us, and he was African-American, and he had the hardest time understanding the approach that the VP had, because he just felt like, you know, the VP had a lot of discriminatory way of expressing himself, even at times when his intention wasn't that. So I think it's very important to be able to explain yourself, but also then ask the folks that you're interacting with to say, hey, you know, this is where I'm coming from. This is my intention, but I know that I might be coming at this the wrong way. You know, what's the way for me to come at it that makes sense? And if I say stuff, if I have approach that offends you or that's offensive, please let me know. So you're creating that space. And then on the other end, if you're opening up the opportunity for people to let you know how they feel and how you're showing up and it might offend them, then you got to be able to be receptive to hear that. So a lot of us would say, oh, we want to create the space, but then we don't know what to do once the information comes to us. And I think it's important to be able to go back to that co-designing model. Because if someone that works for you, or they live in the community that you live in, or, you know, you sit on the board with them, or whatever interaction that you have, it's really important to be able to figure out, like, what is that communication level looks like, so they can be transparent. They can be transparent to you, and that you can be transparent to them as well.
Thank you. I'm just looking through the chat, and I'm not seeing any specific questions. I don't know if I mentioned that the next seminar is actually being planned for the November timeframe.
Harriet Ward, I see that.
What is?
Please, yeah, feel free. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, I raised my hand.
I saw you.
So you said something about being on the same page. You're talking about being on the same page. And all I want to say was, you can have a room full of people who are on the same page. That doesn't mean they don't have anything to learn. They might have the same goals, the same wishes, but have knowledge gaps and understanding gaps that they're not even aware of. That's sort of part of implicit bias even. But I mean, I can be gung-ho about racial justice and still do stupid stuff, still say stupid stuff, still say hurtful stuff, still say trauma triggering stuff, still say stuff like that. So you're never really preaching to a choir, because choirs have different parts.
Yep.
So you got to address that. You have the same goal, but you don't have the same knowledge. That's all.
No, thank you for sharing that. And I think even within a sub community, we're all shaped differently. We all have different perspectives that we carry with us. I had an incident that happened with a really good friend of mine that I grew up with, and I went to the church that his father pastored. And during youth group, this was a predominantly white church, and I've been going to this church for like forever. And I was very close to this dude, this guy, my good friend Ben. And so during youth group, what they used to do is they'll let different people play different types of music, right? And so it was my turn to play the music, and Ben didn't want to let me play the music. So Ben got so angry. And Ben got so angry that the next thing that he said, in order to emphasize his point, he said, "Get out of here with your nigger music." And I remember I was shocked. I was completely shocked. I said, "Ben, did you just say that to me?" And I remember my youth leader came and picked me up and brought me to the side. And he's like, Dale, it's okay. Just relax, just relax. I was furious. I was so furious that somebody that I trusted, a family that I trusted, a person that I shared so many experiences with, that in order for him to make his point, he had to go back to my skin color in order to degrade me.
Dale, I'm mad at the youth group leader because instead of interrupting that, he took you aside and told you not to fuss. That's wrong. That's almost worse than that blatant, awful word. When people shut us down, when we have a complaint and it's legitimate, and you shut it down because we don't want to hear any angry Black people, we don't want any conflict, and they think that's peacemaking. That's not peacemaking, and I don't know you, but when stuff like that happens to me, it actually adds to my trauma. I have a stomach ache, but now I have to stuff something.
Yeah.
And I'm not being authenticated. I'm not being acknowledged. I'm not happy with the youth leader.
Yeah, I stopped going to church. I actually stopped going to church for 8 months, and it completely changed the relationship I had with the church for the rest of my life, because I couldn't believe that the way my friend Ben reacted, and I couldn't believe there was no repercussion for anything else. And even today, when I talk to Ben about the incident, and we've been friends for like 19 years. Since I came to America, he was friends with me. And I was doing a presentation back in May where I really unpacked this experience. And when I called him, he's like, yeah, I kind of do remember that, Dale, but Dale, I'm not racist. He literally said that, like, I did a research on Senegal when I was younger. I was like, oh, so even later on in life, he still didn't recognize what he did and how it impacted me. I remember, so this is how the kind of the negative racial impact actually played out in my life. I remember I was in my sophomore year, and I was in the process of talking to this girl. She was a white girl, and I would go over their house, and the mom and dad, everybody was so like welcoming. Oh, Dale, da 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 da. And I thought, I was like, oh man. And I remember one time the girl said on the phone to me, she says, Dale, I've been having this conversation with my parents lately, and they've been asking me, so hypothetically, if you and Dale, let's say you guys get serious and you eventually get married and you have mixed children, how would you react the way people would look at your mixed children? And that was it to me, because it wasn't about how she would react. It was the fact that the parents felt so uncomfortable that me talking to their girl might lead to me dating the girl, and it might lead to me actually marrying her. And they weren't down for them having biracial children. And I remember like times when things like that started happening. Mind you, I moved to America as a young boy from the Congo, and over time, I've lived in America longer than I've lived in Africa. So the people that took me in, I felt at times that, like, I trusted them and we had relationship. And this is the people that were close to me. And at times they would hit me in the heart, in the most sensitive area of who I was as a human that had nothing to do with who I was, but they were referring back to my skin color. So I tell you this because it's important to understand that the microaggression does not only play out when people are out there to get people, right? the microaggression plays out in most of people's life based on where the sensitivity spots are. So I want to throw it back to you guys. Betty, it looks like you have something to say, Betty.
Well, wait 1 second. Someone had something in the chat that I don't want to overlook, if you don't mind. This was one question where they asked, can you elaborate on ways to create the comfortable and open space so everyone feels ready to share? We have began diversity and inclusion discussions in the workplace, but it seems many are hesitant to speak honestly around coworkers.
So you're not gonna get the soundbite that you need in this brief description. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
You're not going to get the soundbite that you need in this brief description to solve your issues. I think what needs to happen is you need to be able to include. It's not just on you to try to figure out what's the best way to engage in this conversation. You have to include people from all different perspective and background in how to engage in this. So I want to show you just an example of when I host discussions, what it looks like. So this was after the political election of 2016, where everybody felt this just pressure, and the conversation was on how do we move forward. So in all my presentation, I usually start off by, I meet with certain stakeholders and ask them, hey, how do we want to set up the norm? What are the key things that we want to touch on to make sure that everybody are represented in how we engage? And then I form the structure of the presentation based on that norm. And then when we invite everybody to come together, I state those norms and then facilitate the process of the conversation to those norms in order to allow everybody to engage. So I'm going to show you guys just a small little clip of like what it actually looks like when, when people are engaging in this conversation.
Exposure. I grew up in a very wonder-bred, white, suburban life, but was always curious and open. And from the time I turned 18 and left home and joined the military, to time I worked for the government and traveled, to the rest of my adult life, I have sought out difference and sought out diversity, but without a lot of, and watched movies and read books, but without a lot of in-person cultural experience. The analogy I gave was walking into a sports bar and knowing nothing about football. You don't know how to connect. When you say, yay, you hit a home run in a football game, people aren't going to really connect to you. So that's kind of the world I was living in. And just from immersion, I'm getting more connections and more awareness, and it's getting easier and the doors are opening. It's not like all of a sudden I got an education. It's more just that, I'm getting more friends. I have more connections and it's easier. So, and from the school that my kids have gone to, there's a lot of families there that are from diverse backgrounds.
So I wanted to show that real quick, because you have to be able to create a space. You need a good facilitator that's going to call things out, because a lot of times people are going to talk from high level, right? So you got to be able to have a facilitator that's going to help dig deeper. Even in the small group that we had, that I just had earlier with one of the group, someone said something and I said, oh, tell me more. So how does that play out? Oh, so what did that look like? Because a lot of times when people are unpacking, they're going to unpack from a high level. So you got to be able to help go down to the root of what they're trying to say in order to get to the core of what the discussion is. And in the space like this,
I think what is great is
everybody gets their own
someone else
way to express.
Don't try
once
to
you set that,
overtalk them, see their perspective and, where they're coming from and, the views they share. And I think telling different stories really, makes a difference. And the more you communicate with someone else, the more you talk to them and you get to know, whatever they value and whatever they, see that, whatever people else.
I wanted to show this real quick. So I was leading a workshop and I have all the videos I'm showing, I have the right to show you guys. So I don't want you to be like, oh, if I speak, Dale's going to take my stuff. No. So I was hosting a workshop with the Recovery Centers community in New Hampshire. And this lady, she had this realization in the midst of her reflection. And I found it really fascinating.
Categories, because I didn't write down all the words, but from what was in the previous section we were talking about, that for me, there was all this individual stuff, right? Like that's what we're talking about, our own history. And while I knew civil rights, I lived through civil rights history, but not before that. So the systemic stuff that comes from the very beginning of our country was not something that had ever occurred to me. So when I started hearing all this white privilege stuff, I thought from an individual history perspective. And so I didn't want to acknowledge certain things. This whole conversation out of the last few weeks, what has come up, and some of the historians, the journalists, the activists, the people who know the Black history and are able to put it out there, this is new to me. And it, like, I feel enlightened. Like, okay, oh, I get it. When you say history, I was thinking about my history, not about the history.
So I just wanted to share that because everybody's gonna, it's not as black and white as you think that, you're just gonna have a conversation and people are gonna get to that point right away and you're gonna be able to solve stuff. Like, it takes time. And I think that it's more important to include folks that have a perspective to be able to share what their experiences are and what they want the experience to look like. And then you craft the engagement based on a collective feedback in order to create a space where people feel like they can engage. And it takes a lot of time to be able to do that. So whoever that you have within your organization and your team that's appointed to facilitate this stuff, you just got to make sure that during the creation of the event that everybody's being touched on in order for them to present their opinion on what they want to see come out of it.
Deo, I think we're getting short on time. I don't know if we have time for like one more question, and then we should do the closing remarks.
Yes. I think Miss Betty, did you have something to say? Okay. I think Miss Harriet had her hands up. I don't see her anymore. I think she left.
Why don't we just move into the closing remarks?
Okay. Jay, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I think I've got myself already unmuted. I'm Jay Linehan. I'm the president and CEO of the Greater Lowell Community Foundation. Deo, I'm looking at my watch, 11:30. It seemed like we started this 15 minutes ago. Great presentation, flew right by. I definitely want to thank you for your work here today and for the work that you continue to do. To all the attendees, thank you also for taking the time out of your day to do this. I loved Harriet's comment when we talked about you were preaching to the converted, but the fact of the matter is the converted still need to learn a lot more. I consider myself converted, but I know so little and need to know so much more to do the work that I think we all need to do in the community. I think we all need to take a leadership role with regard to this issue. I think we all have a responsibility. And as we all leave here today, I don't think it's we go and go back to our job and just say, gee, that was a great thing this morning. What are we going to do? What's our takeaway? What's our action item on this? What's the next step? Is the community we want out there today? And the answer is no. So it means we all need to do something. And let's convert the unconverted, and let's continue to have this discussion. I want to definitely thank Enterprise again for taking the lead on this. The Greater Lowell Community Foundation is thrilled to be a partner, not only with Enterprise, but with the Chamber and the Lowell Plan and the Nonprofit Alliance. This is the first step of many, many steps we're going to need to have. This is a continuum. There is no question about that. We need to continue to have these discussions amongst us, between us, and we'll continue to have these forums going forward, as has been mentioned a couple times. This is this first step in many, and I know it's also been mentioned to take the survey. Surveys are really, really important. because we really get a sense as to how that played out. And as you do that, that data informs as we go forward. So again, Dale, and for everybody that participated and for all the work we need to do for racial equality and inclusion, thank you and have a great day. Kira, are we done? Is that the day? Is that the?
Yeah,
That's all.
thank you.
Thank you so much.
I think that's all she wrote.
For everybody there too. So the survey is under the chat.
And we'll send that out through email. Thank you so much to everybody who came.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deo.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dale.
Thank you.
This was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody who hung in there. I guess actually our material said 11 o'clock, so my apologies.
11 o'clock would have been too soon.
Thank you.
Yeah, Jeff Hassel from Lazarus House over in Lawrence. This has just been a timely, very important beginning of a discussion. I really appreciate what you guys are doing.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Mr. Duncan.
You.
We miss you.
Well, I'm going to be around tomorrow. Are you going to be in the office?
No, I'm working from home still.
Okay. Sophie, are you going to be there tomorrow? No? Well, anyway, we'll communicate the same way.
Yes, sounds good. Thanks for joining, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan.
Yeah.
Bye.
Hi, Andrew Duncan.
Hey, Dad. Hey, George. Thanks, everyone.
Family connection here.
Yeah.
Andrew, when are you gonna come over and cut my grass?
I'm on my way.
I
Beautiful day to do that.
I'm still waiting. We'll see you guys.
Thank you so much, Deo.
Okay, I'm gonna hop off. It looks like there's just 20 people left. So if anybody would like to connect, you have Deo's contact and you can always email us at the bank.